I'm a Californian. No matter where I might live now, a lot of my touchstones in how I see the world, the references that I use, come from my Californian upbringing. Um, some of the best memories that I have as a kid were summers in the back of our Volkswagen van, driving around and visiting national parks. One of my favorites were in Northern California, where you could see redwoods, the size and scale of which are really hard to wrap your head around, let alone trying to capture in a photograph. And when I start thinking about the time and effort that goes into creating a literature review, one of my first touchstones might be a redwood, uh, one of the largest living things on the earth, some of the longest living ones, that has incredible root systems, a trunk, and the branches kind of like every other tree, but on a scale that's really kind of hard to wrap your head around. And I think in a lot of ways, trying to attack it is you could either uh, start and kind of brutally attack it, which might serve short term benefits, but might have long term costs. Like cutting down some of the old redwoods. I don't know if you can actually drive through them. When I was a kid, we used to be able to drive through a redwood that they had carved an actual hole in. Um, but hacking it down might not serve, and thinking of something as the large and the most impressive ways at creating something might not necessarily be the most applicable, because the literature that we cover as social scientists can get overwhelming. The size and scope of it could be something like a redwood, but in a lot of ways, what it takes to get to the finish line and create something that the authors that we read have published requires something that's even that requires more dedication, more history, and more effort. And so, for me, a touchstone would be not necessarily the redwood, but another kind of tree, also in Northern California, that is more gnarled, more weather worn, and tougher, I would argue, than a redwood tree, and that would be a Bristol cone pine. I don't know how many of you have actually seen Bristol cone pines. It is some absolutely amazing country. I would encourage you to get there if you have the chance. But they are some of the oldest living things in the world. And the oldest, the location of which is hidden because the National Forest um, um, administrators realize, human nature being what it is, that it's safer if people don't know where the actual tree is. This tree that dates back almost 5,000 years. Doesn't look like much, has seen a lot, and every branch, every root, every twist of the tree is hard earned. And so when I try to think about literature reviews, I think this is the kind of metaphor that I'm gonna go through. Um, so, kind of a labored and painful analogy, but writing is labored and painful, right? And so I wanted to touch on a couple of things that hopefully will make your writing process easier. Um, I've summarized my takeaways in a guide for writing a literature review that's on my website or on this course page. But I thought I would go over a couple of things to reiterate things that I found that I think are important. First of all, summarizing a literature, I think it helps to think about how we generate knowledge and how we build this knowledge, and how crafting a literature review is in some ways similar to that. I think there's a couple of different ways. Ad hoc, I think, is probably the most common, that because of the readings that you were assigned in a class, or readings that you came across because you were interested in a particular topic, shape the way that you think about an outcome and what are the most plausible explanations for it. And when you write a literature review, I know a lot of articles that I've written. You just you have major debates in the literature, like the greed or grievance literature, in explanations for civil conflict. This was a dynamic that's highly cited, it's influential, and you want to try to address those big kind of questions in your literature that you get a sense of as being the most important because of what you read, who you talked to, and your experiences in conferences or whatever. A second way would be review articles that you, excuse me, that you read the annual review of political science or another literature review that summarizes the literature according to that person's knowledge and experience. Often they're people who were steeped in this literature and know a lot about it. And that has a lot of strengths. It's hard to generate that much knowledge about a specific topic. You can spend years on it, but then you also might have your own weathered, gnarled, and hard to move exterior assumptions that you might have about a specific topic. So review articles are the next step. I would argue that's more systematic than ad hoc literature reviews. Less common in political science than in other fields would be sensitivity analyses or meta analyses, works that have a transparent and systematic approach at summarizing the literature by downloading everything that is on a topic that meets a couple of keywords. Meta analysis, if you're interested in economic growth and conflict, you would download all quantitative articles that study that and see how large the effect is across different samples. So those are sensitivity analyses, and meta-analyses are a third and arguably more systematic way at trying to build knowledge. Systematic reviews would be a qualitative view of that, version of that, in which you download all the literature, read it, and then develop your own understanding of the themes that arise from it. And so you can follow any of these approaches that kind of speaks to you, what literature you want to include. But often in writing literature reviews, that is the approach that a lot of people take, depending on what their focus is and their experience. In my guide, I gave 6 elements to a literature review. First is a starting point. What interests you about a specific topic? What stands out from the panoply of different topics and articles and directions that you can go? Sometimes you just might have a particular attraction to a specific topic and you want to just delve into that, and you have an excuse to do so with a paper you want to write. And I would say from there, you start with the sources, read everything that you can get your hands on that topic, take good notes, summarizing those readings. When you read for a literature review or for anything else, you want to read strategically. You want to make sure that it's from a credible source. There's a lot of predatory journals that will pretty much publish anything as long as you are willing to pay to have it published, either online, mostly online predatory journals. So is the publisher or author a credible source? What are the important concepts or jargon that are being included in the readings? What do they mean? And are these concepts used in similar or different ways across sources? What are the causal mechanisms? It's a common term in political science for basically the reasons for something occurring. What are the stories, the causal stories that have been told linking some factor or some group of factors to a particular outcome? Are there any debates about those causal stories in the literature? The greed and grievance debate in civil conflict is a visible one that's relevant to me, but there's a bunch of other debates in different literatures. Or often about the relative importance of different outcomes. What are the main findings that the different articles reach, and how substantively important are they? It can be hard, but important to try to focus not necessarily on the fact that there is a relationship, but how much changes, right? If economic spending goes up by 10% for some outcome, how much of that outcome actually um, uh, changes because of that increased spending, right? What's the substantive effect? Can you group some of these different explanations into general kind of causal stories, right? Is it economic stories for conflict? Is it political stories for conflict? Is it um, marginalized ethnic groups' grievances as a cause of conflict? Can you group different stories and look at those as a coherent or more or less coherent grouping that you could start to organize the literature in ways that make sense to you? Some articles are cited a lot more than others. Google Scholar is a useful way. Once you get a topic, you can look at the different sources, see which ones have been cited the most, is one way of kind of judging impact, or what are the major publications in a particular field. And you can see who has cited them. You can limit it to just the latest couple of years to see what the most recent research has been published. Take notes on that, and then you can kind of take a step back from the reading in your notes and start to synthesize it in your own head. What themes keep coming back again and again? These kind of larger debates about the outcome that you want to look at. You can choose three, maybe four of those themes to focus on in your literature review. You can create an outline focusing on those themes, um, and then narrow down um, um, your thematic discussions to those, and start to think about how they can play off each other, complement each other, substitute each other, right? One of the questions I get an awful lot from students is how many articles you need to discuss. In my guide, I have a graph of the number of articles people in my class have included in their literature review to get you a sense of the range. Didn't plot the number of the grades according to the number that are included, because it would be all over the place. You can choose 10 articles that have a solid foundation, a really interesting thematic grouping, structured really well, and that's enough. Some people have more, some people have a few less. The goal is to really delve into the who's the audience for what they're writing, what are the main arguments they're making, what are the findings are, and how these things speak to each other, past each other, and deal with it in an engaging fashion. There's a clear structure to a lot of literature reviews. For my classes, I would encourage you to think about in the introduction, why are you writing it? Why does it matter? Why is the topic important, and why you want to spend time on it? What's the scope? Are you narrowing your story to the literature that's been published in the last 5 years, the last 10 years? One's focusing on a specific subtopic. How did you choose the sources that you looked at? How can you be sure that they're the most important, interesting, or substantive articles that you really want to focus on? Then after that intro, where you set the stage and let the audience know what those different elements are, then you talk in those thematic sections. What are the conclusions the literature reaches? Are those conclusions plausible? Why or why not? What gaps might there be in the theories that are developed so far? When a lot of articles you will read will point to a theoretical gap, which is another way of saying that I'm making a contribution to the literature. There's something the literature hasn't taken into account. I would encourage you to try to highlight or try to think about where there might be gaps in the existing literature. the everything is still relatively young. While there might be a lot done on these topics in the field, it's not complete, and so there's a lot of opportunities to make contributions. But it might help you think about what you might want to focus on in your main research paper, but don't overthink it. For an undergraduate essay, if you can identify a real gap, that's great, but you don't have to necessarily identify one. You can try to the synthesis and discussion of the topics. Once you get to the end of the literature review, you should have that foundation to start to think about a proposal for your own research that would contribute to it, and then thereby you might identify what your real conclusion is actually doing. Then in the conclusion, you wrap everything up. You talk about the themes, any cross-cutting themes that connect them or compete with particular explanations, and then you talk about areas for future research or limitations. Include in the bibliography only the articles that you actually reference in the text. You don't have to include every single article you read. That is not helpful. The only articles that you should include in your bibliography are the ones you actually reference. Follow the instructions, follow the rubric, and the guidelines that I gave you for this class or for your instructor, whoever gave it to you, and make sure that there's clear expectations. I try to be explicit in my syllabus and in my guides about what the expectations are, what are the things I'm looking for, and how the final grade is determined given those characteristics. There's a lot of common mistakes that students make over the years. I made them definitely as an undergrad. I spent more time than I'd care to remember writing essays up late at night, often because I didn't plan ahead. So please learn from my mistakes, plan ahead, make a framework for the semester, for your paper, and try to contribute incrementally on a day-to-day basis. You'll be a lot better off than waiting and trying to do it all at one time. Breaking it up into manageable chunks, just having the Word document open, you'd be amazed at how much you can gradually add in a relatively short period of time. A couple of other mistakes are the use of passive tense. My first drafts of almost every paper I have is littered with the passive tense, saying there is something instead of a verb following a direct noun, that the cat jumped over the wall, instead of there was a cat who appeared near the wall and then was over it, right? The cat jumped over the wall. Over-reliance on too many direct quotes from the authors can be tempting. I've seen a lot of students do that. You find it difficult to paraphrase other people's research, and so you just want to quote it directly. That is evidence of the fact that you hadn't spent enough time thinking about the issues and trying to put it in your own head in your own words. So don't rely on quotes that much for your literature review. A few quotes can be appropriate, but not every paragraph. The goal is to try to get your view of the literature rather than somebody else's. Some papers are too short, too long. Follow whatever the guidelines are for the writing. At the ANU, there's a built-in 10% buffer for word count. I'm not going to count words unless it's obviously that is too short. But if it's too long, once you know with normal font and normal size roughly how long things should be, if it gets too long, you just kind of peter out and stop reading. I will read it because I'm interested in getting to the end, and it's my job to try to give you useful feedback. And be consistent with your formatting. General writing tips, briefly. Read the assignment. Give yourself enough time. Start with an outline before you start writing. It gives you the paper an overall structure. Proofread. Read your writing over and over again. I do that with my own writing, which always sucks. The first 10 drafts, and then the 11th or the 12th, you see a marked increase because you feel you have a solid grasp of what you're saying and why you're saying it. Read your writing aloud is a good way to kind of see how well the words flow together. Have others read it is another way of trying to do it. And try to write clearly. Big words. I was a big fan of big words when I was an undergrad. The making things, you can play with language. It's so much fun to play with language, and you learn words. We learn different expressions or analogies. You want to be able to use them, but unless they serve the explicit purpose of the paper and they add something, the goal is comprehension and understanding. And I've read a lot of works that you think that the author is really smart because it's difficult to read, but if the goal is to try to get someone to understand something and change how they think about it, then being clear, I think, is the priority. So that's a lot in a relatively brief amount of time. My question for the students taking my class is, given this discussion and the writing guide, what's the most pressing question that you have about writing a literature review? Because I know a lot of students might have a literature review section of the larger paper, but they never tried to write an entire literature review. So, third lecture question for this class: what outstanding questions that you have, and I can answer them in a follow-on video or discuss them in workshop. But the idea is that the three assignments in my upper level classes start with literature review, giving you an excuse to read widely, think about the main themes, then in the research proposal, how you might map out some conclusion, some contribution to those literature, and in the final paper, you actually can take the essence of the broader literature review and put it into the larger framework. And they end up being much better and stronger essays that students don't have to worry about quite so much at the end of the semester. Good luck. See you soon.